everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack, and today's guest, I have Indre Biskis. She's a current certified Alpine Ski Instructor for Vail Resorts with specialties in adaptive skiing and children's instruction, and she's a former country director of World Learning in Lithuania, and later a program developer for World Learning International programs in Washington, D.C. So please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll go ahead and start today's stories of emotional grit. So Indre, I swear we were meant to meet. This is just crazy. Here I'm in Vail skiing like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and my friends that had planned the trip with me had just said, well, hey, how excited are you to go hit the hills in Vail? And I was like, well, I'm super excited to go skiing, but I was looking more forward to meeting people from other countries or meeting people who would have stories from other countries, because I knew that the village of Vail would be just that, kind of this international marketplace, so to speak. So sure enough, I take the chairlift up and stop at a restaurant for lunch where there was barely any seating. And you were kind enough to invite my friends and I over to have lunch with you. And of course, the stories ensued. So before I get ahead of myself, why don't we take a step backwards, back to the late 1930s, early 1940s, when your parents were growing up in Lithuania. Now, it's my understanding that this is back when the Bolsheviks were running the country, which it's my understanding also that they went on to become the Communist Party. Is that correct? So same verbiage, Bolsheviks and the Communist Party?
Yeah, they were the Bolsheviks was like the party at the time that was taken over. They were growing, the Reds were growing, but no, Lithuania was an independent country during the time that my parents were there. And in about 1944 is when they were coming in to take over and coming with their tanks and whatever they were coming with. And my parents literally ran by with their horses and their wagons following them with as whatever they could carry in, like I said, in 1944. My father even put up a little plaque on the oak tree of his childhood home saying the date, which was, I believe, July 17th of that year, 1944.
Wow. So now back then your parents didn't know each other, correct?
No.
Yep.
They met after they came to the United States.
Okay. And between being in Lithuania and then, of course, coming to the States, they both spent time in East Germany, correct?
They spent time in Germany at the time. It wasn't East Germany at that time. It was West Germany. My mom went to Hamburg, where she ended up studying medicine, and my dad went to Augsburg, where he had already studied engineering in Lithuania, but he was then helping with with translations of people that were coming in, all the displaced persons, because he spoke German and Lithuanian and English.
Oh, wow. So I can't even fathom being in their early 20s and having to spend time in a different country and then, of course, permanently move to a different country. It's just, did they tell you any kind of stories of what it was like to make that transition and just the differences in languages and culture and just what it was like to actually move?
They, interestingly enough, I think as many people, they didn't talk very much about those times that they did talk about. I think it was quite traumatic for them. But what they did talk about was the sense of community in the displaced persons camps. They became very close with one another there. They were living, 5-10 people in a room, and with like just like a sheet for from one room to the other, and so they had a lot of stories with that. And of course, they would talk about the story. My mom did tell us stories about when they were escaping and they literally were hearing the gunshots behind them because the front was coming in to Lithuania as they were leaving.
Oh.
And yeah, so as I said, there was
Wow.
probably a lot of trauma at that time.
Oh, absolutely. So then when they came here to the States, they ended up in the Chicago area, correct?
Yeah, eventually, right. My mom first went to Brockton. My father went to Chicago right away. And then, as my mom was still finishing her medical training. And she then eventually, through a couple of stops, ended up in Chicago.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you had mentioned in what you had written for me that you didn't speak English until starting school because you were in a Lithuanian household, where different languages were spoken. So that being said, what different languages did you speak before learning how to speak English?
Lithuanian.
Okay.
It was Lithuanian. My grandmother, it was just like since I did end up living later in Lithuania, I later realized that she recreated Lithuania because we lived on 5 acres and we grew all of our vegetables. And I mean, she was making things from farm to table basically for us.
Wow.
It was back
Wow.
in Lithuania.
Okay.
So, and our friends were mostly Lithuanian. My parents' friends would come on the weekends, and that's who we would play with. Since my brothers and I were pretty much alone in the countryside. So,
Wow. So at least there was some kind of familiarity there as far as the language and the customs and the culture and that kind of thing, just to kind of have that sense of normalcy for you.
yeah.
So, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. For them, definitely, I think it was a sense of, the whole community, the Lithuanian community. They thought that they were going to be going back to Lithuania. They thought it was a very temporary measure. That it was taken over, but we'll be helped. We'll be able to go back in a couple of years. So and they realized it was taking much longer than they thought it would. So they ended up. Forming Lithuanian schools, which I went to on Saturdays, and we learned the language and we hung out with people that were Lithuanian. We really got the sense that we were going to go back even as children.
Wow.
Lithuanian, even though we were.
So of your family members who either had chosen to stay behind, hoping that it was going to be temporary, so they had stayed in Lithuania, like you mentioned before that some of them that they were actually sent to Siberia by the Russians, and that not all of them were able to come home. Was there a common theme there as far as why they were sent to Siberia, or like had they been like anti-establishment, so to speak, trying to maintain their independence, or what happened there?
Well, the Bolsheviks were kind of like a party that was for the. I don't know, I guess they called it like the worker party, sort of something like that. And so anybody, when they took over, anybody who had anything, for instance, farm, land, if they had education, they were all considered enemies of the state. And they were literally over 200,000 people were deported to Siberia. Because they were just because they had an education, they were teachers, or they were from landowners of any sort.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So of your family members who had to go to Siberia, were they able to write letters, or was it just no communication at all? And so people had to wonder what was going on.
That was, they probably didn't have much access to paper, first of all, and getting the letters out would have been very difficult. There's been interesting books written about these the mass deportations. There was even a movie made, Ashes to Snow, called Ashes to Snow, about it, and based on a book that was written, and it just gives a really good picture of how little people had, and that they were transported from one place to another to another. They never knew where they're going to be, and no cold, sometimes no clothing, warm clothing, and so many people died while doing so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was the thought that they were going to work camps, or was it just kind of this ambiguous thing?
Well, it's kind of, it was like work camps. I guess that would be what it was. But it was really more death camps would maybe be better, because they really didn't expect to come back. So they didn't expect people to come back. They were just sending them off, and didn't have too much going for them when they were there. I mean, to talk about grit, those people had grit, the people that made it and came back. And my grandmother's sister, she was one person that did. And a lot of the folks that were out there then also were very much smaller, and they had, less hair and things like that because they had their bodies had suffered so much from the malnutrition and everything.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so
So,
she was tiny. She was absolutely tiny. That aunt of my
wow.
great aunt that came back. But lovely people. Yeah.
So of your family members, how many were able to come back?
Um, my grandmother had 7 sisters, and there was a lot of cousins too. So I can't give
Okay.
you a. I definitely know my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, went and came back. And there was cousins as well, but I can't recall because the stories are so old and I was told so long ago. So
Yeah.
remember that there was some, but I can't remember which ones. I probably, when I go back to Lithuania in a month, which is where I'll be in a month, I'm going to be talking to some of my relatives to find out about that more deeply.
Oh, good opportunity, to
Mhm.
hear those firsthand accounts or
Yeah,
secondhand for that matter,
yeah,
whoever it is. But wow.
yeah.
So circling back to you here in the US, I know you had mentioned before that you actually spent time going to Lithuania for the first time as part of an exchange program for a month. Was it like a high school one, or what was the situation?
I was 21, I think it was, and it was the Cold War. The Iron Curtain had been up very hard for several years, and under Andropov, who was the leader in Russia at the time, it kind of things became kind of defrosted a little bit. So that's when there used to be this exchange program of Lithuanians being able to go to see Lithuania, and they opened it up again because for a lot of years it wasn't allowed for people to
Oh,
come in, and so we went in there. It was an exchange, kind of like an umbrella program. They called it something. They wanted to allow us in to kind of show us how great it is over there. And
right.
what was interesting at the time is uh, video was just becoming big. Okay, so you could transport videos. And so this information at that time, just when it was just starting to warm, the relations started to warm a little bit, information from the West started to filtrate into Lithuania. And of course, there was a lot of other kind of underground efforts that had been taking place between the Catholic Church and Lithuania for a long time to exchange information on some of the bad things that were happening there. And but when this information started coming through, it was almost like opening a dam, and eyes wide open, people were really starting to see what the differences were between the Soviet Union and the West. And they started to, I think, start change. And Glasnost happened 1 year later. It was happening
Hmm.
1 year. Gorbachev came into power at that time, and things opened up enough for Lithuania to start greater efforts to seek its independence, although it always had.
So when you mentioned the efforts that the Catholic Church had made and different organizations try to get information outside the Iron Curtain, do you know of any examples of things that people would try to do just to get messages out?
Oh yeah. Well, a lot of it happened through. I mean, literally, the kind of spy stories that you hear. That's the kind of the ways that they would get information out. It happened through some priests would have access to talk to greater numbers of people. They were gathering information of what was happening in Lithuania, who the dissidents were, who was getting jailed or whatnot. What was happening with that, or what the KGB took, who was the KGB was taking over, and on this side, the Catholic Church, I had, as a matter of fact, one of my friends was working with the Catholic Religious Aid, which was accepting this information. There was letters that were being smuggled out in whatever way they could. People walking across borders, but they were always physical letters, and through through the church, as I said, through different people that they knew, and they would get to the Catholic Religious Aid. That information would then be spread around, and they would try to send support in some way to help certain people escape too. You know,
Wow.
yeah. So that was I don't have the firsthand knowledge, but there's been actually books written about that, and even I think I even saw a movie about it one time with the whole the struggles of the people and getting them across to getting them out of the country so that they wouldn't be dead, basically. You know, that would have
Right.
Mhm.
So when you were there as part of this exchange program, were there things you noticed as far as like people trying to ask questions about the West? I mean, they must have been asking you questions, I would think, about like music
Oh,
and things they would just crave that they didn't have access to. So I'm just wondering, because music can unite people, whether it's hymns at a church or perhaps songs at a nightclub or whatever. It doesn't
yeah,
matter who you are or where you're from. The music can unite people.
yeah.
And it can actually affect you physically, whether it's the dopamine levels in your brain, those feel-good chemicals, or reducing stress hormones, or heaven forbid, having fun at a club. But do you recall any situations like that, as far as people in their early 20s over there as well, asking you about whether it was pop culture or anything else from America?
Absolutely. I mean, it was, yeah, singing. Oh my God. The singing was happening all the time. There was groups that were singing, and a lot of times those groups were the ones that were able to travel internationally. So they knew more about what was going on elsewhere as well.
Oh,
But
okay.
we hung around with those people a lot. That was really fun. Um, you know, I mean, yeah, you're right. Music is very important. And the people that, but I wanted to mention one thing about that experience. So, because when I ended up in Lithuania in 1992, I found out one of my friends he was in charge of opening up the KGB files. And when he opened up the files, he actually uncovered our group that was in Lithuania. They had a file on each and every one of us that was there. There was about 20 of us. And to this day, I don't know who it was, but one of those people was a KGB agent within our group we were really close to each other, and we didn't know it. I mean, that's how we
Really?
were. The rooms, I mean, everything you've heard in or seen in, like, oh, I don't know, different. There's a Sean Connery movie, The Russia House. I mean, if you see the way he's talking about, they're listening. Everybody was listening. You in 1984, it was a very stifling feeling
Yeah.
to be there, because you did not feel free. You did not feel free. You would walk across the street or run across the street. Somebody would stop you and question you. I mean, that happened to me.
Wow.
So it was
How, do you
frightening.
recall how your KGB file read about you?
Mine was, I wasn't really, a spy or anything like that. There was some people that were really collecting and transferring information. It really did bring over those videos and video recorders and things like that.
Wow.
I did not. I did not see my file. I just know that there was one on me.
That's crazy. That is crazy.
I know.
So,
Just my lifetime. I can't even believe it.
right. That's just, I mean, so I would imagine now in everyday life, when you hear someone complain about something that really shouldn't be that big of a deal, you're probably thinking, well, I had a KGB file on me. Try beating that. It's like things
I
that people nowadays get so bent out of shape over. And it's like, we have it pretty good here. But a friend of mine who I met through work a number of years ago helped bring the stock exchange back to Hungary after the Iron Curtain fell. Apparently, Hungary's stock exchange started back in the 1800s, and it disappeared because of the communists. And then he helped bring it back. And one of the biggest challenges they had was that the companies were, of course, owned by the state. And now they had to be privatized again, so that then you could actually sell the shares to raise capital to then help fund the companies. And he had to try to work through that with people. And he shares these stories about how in Hungary, just like what you're describing, people were afraid that the Russians were always listening, and you never knew who you could trust. So a lot of the meetings they would have about the stock exchange would take place in bank vaults, because the bank vaults they figured couldn't be bugged. So they would talk and meet in the bank vaults, and you do what you got to do and figure it out. Hence the whole mindset of emotional grit, So it's just crazy stuff. And just for context, so here you're experiencing these things when you're over in Lithuania. And this you said was around, what was it, 92? Would it have been probably?
Well, those experiences were 1984.
Oh,
Just
excuse me, as part of the exchange program.
like the George Orwell book. It's
Right.
no,
So,
that was before the fall of the Soviet Union, before the fall of the wall. After the wall came down, things really started heating up, and Lithuania was behind the Iron Curtain. It wasn't just like Poland, which was more of a satellite, I guess, or something like that.
yeah.
It was more deeply behind the curtain. They didn't even have a separate color for the country. They just kind of on the world map, you'll see it was all part of Russia. And so during that time, they just and I lost my track right now. The country. So anyway, in 1992, things were different. So.
Oh, yeah. So I recall when I was in high school, so this would have been the late 80s, because I graduated in 91. And I remember my social studies teacher, I think this was 1989, if I'm not mistaken, walked into the classroom and was just dumbfounded. And he said to the class, including me, the Berlin Wall is coming down. And we were just like, what? Because we had been told for so long that in Berlin, like way over in Germany, that the wall separated families. It kept people from seeing each other for years. And of course, back then there was no World Wide Web, so you couldn't just all of a sudden get on there and if you were in East Germany, you couldn't just figure out very easily what was going on the West side, And so it's just, and I didn't know until I went to Germany last summer. Last summer, I spoke at a neuro-oncology conference in Hamburg. So I visited, where parts of the wall still are. I didn't realize that it's actually two, because you have the wall on the east side and then a no man's land, and then the western side. And just standing there by the wall, it's like I couldn't even speak. I just stood there and looked at it, and I thought, think of how many people died. Think of how many people, were separated from loved ones. And
Right.
to actually see things that before I just saw in history books at school or learned about in my social studies class, but to see them firsthand really personified things. And talking to you today, and then of course talking to you at Vail as well, just really added a whole other layer of wow. I mean, it's just it makes things real. You know what I mean? And I know you had mentioned that you had worked for the Peace Corps. And so I'm wondering if you could tell people a little bit about what you were doing in Lithuania and then eventually Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So I came back and I finished my MBA in 1985 after returning, but it was really strange because I was thinking, gosh, there's half of the world that doesn't even know what a market economy is. I mean, they deal on barter exchange and people help each other by exchanging products and things like that, whatever they've grown. So I kind of started leaning in a different direction from my MBA from business. I started thinking about what else I could be doing. Well, I had anyway worked for a few years, and then in 1991, well, actually 1988, I started really doing some activist work when I was living in New York City, and we were doing a lot of the demonstrations when things were opening up when the wall was coming down. It hadn't come down yet, but it was coming.
Yeah.
You could feel it coming. There was a lot of
Yeah.
demonstrations. We were demonstrating for Czechoslovakia, for Hungary, for Poland, and then Lithuania got that in to be able to put their flag on to their former fortress, the Lithuanian flag, yellow, green, and red, and take down the communist flag, the red with the hammer and sickle.
Mm-hmm.
This was a great symbolic move, and there was it was called the Runaway Republic. It had the guts to do this. In 1991, the Russians tried to come in, and they killed 11 people under tanks and things as they were trying to take over the TV tower to take communications of Lithuania over. The Lithuanian public absolutely stood against them, all in crowds, kept them from it. And what saved them was the media, because that went all over the United States, all over, not United States, all over the world. That was televised, and it changed the course of events for Soviet Union. Lithuania became free. There was certainly a long way to go still, but going there, and so it opened up. About 1992 is when Peace Corps came into Lithuania. They started a new program, which was because of all of this change in Eastern Europe. They started a program to send small enterprise development, community development, and English-speaking English teacher volunteers to the former Soviet republics. And we went to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia was our group, was the Baltics. And that was in 1992. We arrived in July. The barricades were still around the parliament. All of the barbed wire was there. There was all kinds of photographs of people that had died and done different things. And it was a very emotional experience to go to Lithuania and to see the flag, something that I had fought for we did a lot of, we were lobbying the UN to accept Lithuania before the fall of the Soviet Union. But then we really did a lot of demonstrations to try to bring this information out west. And in front of the UN, in front of the Russian embassy in Washington. Russian consulate in New York, and things like that. Even in Rockefeller Center, we had a huge demonstration. So what happened was it came down. The wall came down. Lithuania finally became free, and then they were bringing a lot of people from the West were coming in for assistance. A lot of foreign assistance was coming. And so that was part of the effort, coming from all over. The Scandinavian countries, everybody was coming in. The United States was there with a lot of different organizations, and the Peace Corps was who I came with. And it was really cool because Peace Corps is this wonderful program which teaches people about one another by exchanges.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to remember if it was before that trip, but you had shared with me a story about how it was so cold there because, first and foremost, it's a Nordic climate, so I get that. But the Soviets had reparations and sanctions on Lithuania, so that was going to make a difference in the amount of heat you would get. And I believe was it fresh water as well? I think
it was hot water.
Hot water. Okay.
Water. They had water, but it was all really cold in midwinter, and so basically you couldn't get warm. And yes, it was starting later in that winter. It was November. Actually, I ended up in the hospital with meningitis because I got so sick. But for a month, hospital there. I gave my Peace Corps oath from my bed in the hospital. The ambassador came and we did the whole thing there.
Wow, that's dedication.
It was funny, but we so that was in the cold was pretty intense, and yes, there was rationing. The Lithuanians rationed the heat because the Russians had cut it off because we were connected to their system. It was all centralized. Everything in Russia was centralized because everything in the center was in Moscow, right? So that took a while for us to deal with that year, but things started getting better. Actually, both years it was still pretty cold. It was bad.
Wasn't it that people, even in their homes, when they would be speaking, you could see their breath because it'd be so cold.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was
I
that
mean,
cold. And if I remember correctly, people would go to the hills to try to warm up. And now I'm not sure if you pronounce it sauna or sauna. In northern Minnesota, it's
sauna.
sauna, but everywhere
Sauna.
else it's sauna. What was
Mhm.
that?
Sauna.
Sauna. Okay. That people would go to the saunas to just try to warm up, put some water on those
That
rocks. and try to,
one place you could really get warm because you didn't really, I mean, even if you did get hot water every other weekend, it really wasn't that hot. It was just
yeah.
lukewarm. And
Yeah.
so kind of came up with ways of, people came up with ways of keeping warm water. I mean, you had a gas stove, so you keep a pail on there so you could wash your dishes or whatever, or your clothing or yourself that
Mhm.
way. It was challenging.
Oh,
It was,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Where did the gloves on your feet come into play? What was the story there?
I think it was just more of a funny thing. Like we were so cold that we put gloves on our feet. I mean,
Right.
we were just so cold, you didn't know,
Yes.
and you're, especially like if you may have socks, but it's not enough.
Right.
Gloves,
Right.
you know.
I completely understand because living in Minnesota, I'm used to a cold climate. And it's kind of when you're in a cold climate, you learn to figure out the how. So if your car doors are frozen shut, you figure out what to do. If if your windshield wipers have frozen to your windshield, you figure out what to do. I mean, there's just different things where you learn to just persevere and keep going. And another interesting thing about the cold, and I'm curious to see if you experience this in Lithuania, but in Minnesota, when it's so cold outside, it's very common, especially in more rural parts of the state, that if someone gets stuck in the snow, like say their car went in the ditch or whatever, it's very common for someone to just stop by then, a total stranger, to help you out because they know that maybe they're going to be the next one, or maybe it already happened to them. And I know that a friend and I went skiing, and this was in northern Minnesota, and I was driving and I made the mistake of pulling onto a paved snowmobile trail that I thought was a frontage road because it was pretty wide. Well, it turns out it was just for snowmobiles. So, needless to say, the vehicle we were in got stuck. And one of my friends I was with is from out of state. And he kind of got fairly irritated after a few minutes. And he goes, "Oh, what are we going to do? It was either getting dark or dark already. And here we are stuck." And I said, "Oh, don't worry." I'm like, "Someone will stop and help." And he just goes, "Well, what makes you so sure?" And I'm like, "No, really, someone will stop and help." Sure enough, in like minutes, this guy and his son pull over, total strangers, grab shovels out of the backs of their truck, come over, get us out. Didn't even expect a thank you. Like they did what they wanted to do, and then just left. And again, my friend asks me later, "How are you so sure that help would come?" And I said, "Well, it's that sense of relatability, not just empathy, but relatability, because maybe those people had been stuck in the snow themselves, or know it could happen to them in the future." So you kind of come together from that community perspective, even as strangers, when you're enduring something together. And so I'm wondering, for your experience in Lithuania, whether it was the cold or something else, did you see evidence of that, where people came together to help each other out, whether it was neighbors or colleagues or anybody?
Yeah, people will just, the concept of hospitality is huge in Lithuania. Huge.
Okay. Okay.
Um, they will just open up their homes, and by opening up their homes, they're opening up their hearts to you too.
Wow.
And certainly I've seen that with wherever I went. Whenever you don't go to an empty table, someone, my grandmother used to laugh here in the United States. She'd say, you go to somebody's house and they ask you if you want coffee, and you say, no, 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 and then they don't give it to you. Well, first of all, you're supposed to say no first about 5 times. That's the first thing. And the second,
Yeah.
coffee doesn't mean just coffee. Coffee means like in Lithuania, means the entire refrigerator on the table.
Different
So,
different culture.
it's this openness and I think that comes from not having very much.
Mhm.
They
Mhm.
really um, uh, would be very generous and show their generosity because it was so limited what you were able to get there. There wasn't that much food, especially during, it was during the Soviet times. I mean, it was worse. But when I was there, especially when we were coming to in 1992, 93, just looking for food in the grocery stores, you'd find maybe one dried up cabbage, a tiny one, maybe a couple of dried up, wilted beets.
Yeah.
It was and carrots. I mean, you really wouldn't find much. So you would go to the kiosks, kind of wandering around. They were all over the place, and you would look for what they had for the day. Like once in a while, you'd get lucky and you'd get bananas. You'd go to the market in the outdoor market. A lot of things would be brought in from the countryside. There you could find some things, but in the stores, forget about it.
I suppose because were the stores owned by the state?
Yep, that's right.
So it's different. Very different.
I did a project comparing the market economy to the command economy, and I pretended to bring in a lady who was running a grocery store, and the attitude was, no, you can't have anything. No, it was just, there's no service mentality,
Mm-hmm.
which is the opposite of the hospitality mentality.
Right.
It's the opposite.
Right.
Our homes, privately with human beings, each other, there was an openness. But when it became as a state-run thing, it became very cold and not friendly, I would say.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, literally, it was just because perhaps they were looking for. I'm not sure. You'd go to a restaurant and the whole place would be empty, and they'd say there's no room for you.
Really?
And maybe looking for money. You don't know what they were looking for. It's
Wow.
hard for us to figure out being there.
Yeah.
And I'm going back to 1984. It got better in 92, and it continued. And now it's totally beautiful. It's great because I've gone back a few the last couple of years.
Okay. So I know that I've heard examples here of when corporations get bought out, and how even if they were in the same industry, it could be two different cultures, and how it's hard for the company that was getting bought out to adapt to the new culture of the one who bought them out. And so I can't even fathom being in a country where your mindset and the culture is more for hospitality and being rich with the things that count, so to speak, as far as, giving someone or opening up your home and lending a helping hand and things like that. Going from that mindset to all of a sudden a culture that you just described, where it's very gruff, not very inviting, and just kind of, you don't know who you can trust, hence the whole KGB files, that kind of thing. It'll become kind of wearing, I would think, from a mental health perspective.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, what people would tell me, it's like, well, the way to survive here in the old days was you think one thing, you say another, and you do a third. You're completely cognitive dissonance. Everything is confused, so.
Wow.
Yeah, that was because you couldn't speak your mind really, and the freedom that's why they were seeking independence and freedom, to be able to from that, to be able to, self-expression, of self-determination.
Right.
To use your own language.
Yeah. So when you worked with executives over there, was it more from a corporate perspective, or did you also work with politicians as far as like bringing in a market economy and getting back into that mindset?
Yeah. So we did exchange programs. We were sending people to the States for training on, basically, they got a chance to see what their job would look like in the United States, like an analogous job. So we sent economists. It was mostly market economy related things. It was related to opening up. It was everything related to the economy, which was getting different sources of energy. So we sent people to learn about different sources of energy and how to apply them to Lithuania. We sent the finance ministry to people from the ministry to see how our different Treasury Department, everything works and how things are put together. And a very important part of it all was sending kind of small groups as well, not just individual programs, but small groups of people, where we brought together, in one situation, a group from the Ministry of Social Security, Ministry of Finance, and local non-governmental organizations and municipal organizations. So national, municipal, and county, municipal, and non-governmental organizations, to show how all of those work together to support, to make our society work, to make our economy work. It's not siloed. It was more kind of like working
in tandem
and
or
also,
in concert.
Yes, and also having a tie through the non-governmental organizations, having a tie to the society, so you know exactly, what people need. Open hearing, the concept of open hearings were some of the things that we did. We did one of the first open hearings, like Western, our style open hearings, congressional hearings at the Parliament.
Wow.
One of my students actually was the president of Lithuania. I had several ministers who are currently or were recently ministers who went. So apparently they did something right.
What a great wow. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
what you did is amazing. I mean, I just I compare what you experienced. Now some people might say that because of what your family experienced, as far as some having to go to Siberia, your parents independent of one another, getting shot at as they're leaving the country. I mean, just all that stuff. You could have taken an approach where it's, you know what, it's too painful. I can't go to Lithuania. it's just too much. But instead, it's almost like, instead of letting certain things stop you, it's part of what fueled you. It's kind of like, you know what? No, I want to go make a difference. I want to go back there and right some wrongs and be a voice for people who can't speak, as far as like, maybe someone wants to reach out to the executives or the politicians, but they just don't have an opportunity to. Whereas you were able to meet with people and teach them how to fish, so to speak. And so, I mean, what an amazing thing! Are there any common themes with that, as far as like, I would imagine the people were probably filled with gratitude. I would imagine, but any responses that come to mind as far as how people reacted?
People's reactions before they went to the States were varied. Some people were excited. Some people very much wanted to go. Some people were like, this is just a United States effort to brainwash us. I mean, that, but I've got to tell you, the ones that had the worst attitudes, and I have one example, and I'm not going to name names, obviously.
Yeah.
But there was one person, he was a department head. He had exactly that bad attitude before going. And we were asking him to put together an action plan of what would you like to achieve? What would you like to have happen? We worked with him as far as doing that, to bring it to the ministry that he was working at. And he came back. I am not kidding. There was stars in his eyes. He's like so excited. He's going to get all these NGOs. We're going to do these open hearings. We're going to start this, and it's going to be so different here. I mean, he was so excited, and that was, it was just a fantastic feeling to know that and this is the thing for me, as far as common theme. I believe in exchange and really trying to walk in another's shoes and trying to understand, instead of, the old St. Francis prayer, seek to understand rather than be understood.
Mm-hmm.
That is what I believe in experiential and exchange learning. If you go to a Peace Corps type of program, World Learning, actually, the organization that I worked with later was the training organization for Peace Corps. Our organization was based on the Peace Corps model, on World Learning's Experiment for International model, which Sergeant Shriver was the first to go to, one of the first ones, and he ended up forming the Peace Corps. So we had very close ties. That's who I ended up working with, was World Learning.
Wow.
afterwards.
Wow.
And it's
Wow.
all experiential learning. It's all about this exchange program. You go there and you get to know people individually as make friends, and you see a world differently. Our whole world would be better if everybody went on an exchange program, I believe.
I can see that. I can see that. But so before we move on to your adaptive skiing program that you work with, are there any closing thoughts or anything on the experiences you've had that we've talked about, that maybe things that I haven't asked about that I should ask about, or anything come to mind before we move on to the other topic?
Well, I just, you had started asking me about, that this is going to be talking about emotional grit. And I think it's
Mhm.
those that have had it, I feel like and I think it's the same thing with the work I do with adaptive services I'm a link to bring freedom and independence to people,
Mhm.
kind of
Mhm.
the feeling I was always thinking about freedom and independence for Lithuania, just knowing what it's not and seeing in our wonderful country in the United States how much we have,
Mhm.
to to um, to share that freedom with other people. So
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting too how whether it's what you did in Lithuania as far as promoting freedom and independence also applies to the adaptive world for people who
very
are wanting to do sports and different things. In this case, skiing, who have some disabilities. So, could you please tell us a little bit about where the program is, how it works, and just some examples of some of the people who ski with you?
yeah, sure. So I work with mostly younger people, mostly children, and typical children and adaptive and persons with disabilities. And my role is to bring the fun and safety of skiing to them. And it's mostly cognitive disabilities, and I'm also trained in visually impaired skiing as well, to teach people how to do that. Um, but my clients it just makes my day to be with them, because I really enjoy going where somebody is in their mind.
Mhm.
I like to
Mhm.
try to get in there and to really um, find the key to that human being, so that the light goes on and it's like, I can do this. And that is my passion, right now. I mean, that's what I do right now. I still go back to Lithuania, but right now with the adaptive program, it is part of Vail Resorts. We have our own adaptive program in Vail, which is my home mountain. And we do programs for families. It can be cognitive, it can be veterans, it can be anybody with disabilities. As I said, my specialty was cognitive.
As far as in reference to the veterans, is it more perhaps where someone has maybe lost part of their leg or maybe part of their arm, or is it people with PTSD, or is it kind of all across the board? Or
All the above. All the
wow.
Yeah, Vail. We have a veterans program. As a matter of fact, last week, I think it was last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, which I did not participate in because I had my adaptive children that I was dealing with. But they have a great program for that. Yeah, and they're all over
Wow.
everybody in every single type of disability. It's so exciting to see everybody able to enjoy the mountain and the
Oh
snow.
yeah. So
Hmm.
if somebody is missing a leg or an arm or maybe both legs, how does the adaptive skiing program work? Like how do they literally get
Yeah.
down the hill, or what
Well,
happens?
how do they get that? Well, it depends on, you'll see if you watch the Paralympics, you'll
Mhm.
see how they get down the hill. I mean, they're in sit skis, where a person who may not have his lower limbs would be sitting and maneuvering the skis with
Wow.
his, and the
Wow.
at the end of the poles, which would be a regular stick pole, is another ski that has a brake on it that person can use to brake with.
Cool.
And if that person knows how to turn, he can brake and turn and stop and do whatever
Okay.
doing
Okay.
it. there's other ways of helping people as well with standing. You can have, if you have just weak legs, you can have something that you're actually with your over your armpits, under your armpits, and you can actually ski. The skis are below you, and you can maneuver that.
Wow.
There's a lot of, if anybody comes to Vail and wants to see what the what our adaptive shed looks like, I can show you all the different types of equipment, because we've got a lot of good equipment.
Wow. So how does it work for people who are visually impaired to make their way and like avoid moguls and get down? And how does that?
No.
I have a hard enough time. So
Well, you can
wondering.
experience it on a day when there's a whiteout and you can't see anything. You can see how hard it is to do, because if you can't see, it's very hard. You have to feel with your feet. But the way we teach it, and we guide a person, for instance, who would be completely blind, would be through voice, and having persons on different sides of that person, so that that person can orient themselves to what's going on where.
Oh.
You can have also in your ear, but I think it almost works better is if it's a live voice, because there's an orientation thing about feeling how far somebody is from you, and so that's a very big deal. But it depends on how visually impaired and what part of your sight is impaired as well. That has to be.
Are they tethered? Are they tethered to the person whose voice is giving them the instruction?
You know what? They can be. Sometimes they may not be.
Okay.
But they in the beginning, they always are, of course, tethered. The tips of the skis are held together with kind of this link, and then the tethers are put to the ends of the skis, and the instructor will guide the person, calling out, saying what they're going to be doing before it's done, but maybe right there at the same time happening. Also, you have a call. You have to make up a word. It can't be, say, fall. It can't say stop. You have to make up a word that's like a word that nobody would ever use, so that it's like for that person to fall, to sit down in case it's a really dangerous situation coming up. Like, puppy dog, that sit down and avoid whatever thing may be, if they're heading for a tree or something like that.
Cool. I know in Minnesota, I've seen some people doing adaptive skiing, but it's been from a distance. So I wasn't exactly sure how different programs are out there. But obviously at Vail, it sounds like there's even more robust things that people could do. But just to have that option too for people who are visually impaired, it makes sense to have more of an auditory experience. I know that happens. My prior podcast guest last time, his name is Brian Wagner. He works for the School for the Blind, and he was talking about how people who are visually impaired or outright blind play hockey. Some of them play baseball, some play soccer. And now with some of the programs, it might be that perhaps the hockey puck has some kind of a sensor on it or a bell on it, so you can hear it. But it's relying on your ability to hear it as opposed to see it. I've also read about, and then I wrote about in my book, people who have sailboats, and they participate in these sailboat races where they're for people who are either just visually impaired or completely blind, because the buoys have bells on them, the boats have some kind of sensors on them, and I think it's hard enough to figure out how things work on a sail, as a sailboat, as far as how the mast is supposed to be and all that. But yeah, they do it even though they can't see. So amazing stories. And I know that people will oftentimes assume that if somebody has some kind of a disability, that has to always keep them from doing something, when in reality, it could be what fuels them. Maybe it's kind of like, you know what, I have this going on, but I'm going to do this anyway. And that's kind of, what fuels them.
I worked in Washington. When I was in Washington, we were working with persons with disabilities at a higher level with their activism through their programs and things like that. And there was a couple of things that folks have mentioned to me. It's not, instead of saying disability, or certainly not handicap, because nobody's handicapped. It's a different ability. Because you always make up for something else with it. And then there was another lady, Marka Bristol, who was very big in the disabilities community, from Chicago, actually. She formed the Center for Independent Living here, for persons with disabilities. She would say it's not if you have a disability, it's when, because we will all have one at some point. You break a leg, you get old and you can't see anymore or hear. And so it's helpful to be aware of that.
And perspective is key. I mean, I know even for me with my brain tumor scare, I mean, I never even knew I had a tumor growing inside my head until in 2016, my eye doctor acted on a hunch. She said, you know what, your peripheral vision exam wasn't quite what it should be the last couple of years. Even though I have peripheral vision, she just acted on a hunch and had me go to a specialist. And then he also acted on a hunch and discovered it. And as far as perspective goes, and it was the size of a golf ball between the outer lining of the brain and by my optic nerve, which is why it affected the vision. But people would say to me for years now, well, Jen, if your tumor was discovered to be the size of a golf ball and it supposedly was growing for like 10 or 20 years, maybe, don't you wish it was discovered 10 years earlier? Because then it would have been smaller. And my response is always no. And that surprises people. Like, why wouldn't you have wanted it discovered when it was smaller? And I'll go on to explain to them, because had it been discovered 10 years earlier, the technology to treat it would have been different. I'll take today's technology, not 10 years ago technology.
Right.
I mean, I think if you can kind of have a mindset where it's just being able to persevere, and maybe you have some kind of a new normal, but being able to adapt to that and figure out what that new normal is. And then to your point, as far as whether it's still pursuing a sport you're passionate about or other things in life, perspective is key.
Mm-hmm.
So good stuff. But
perspective, absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm. Now, are there any websites that you would like to point people to as far as whether it's for perhaps the Peace Corps or the other organization you mentioned, or even the adaptive ski program at Vail?
Yeah, there is the adaptive ski program at Vail. I don't know what the number is, what the actual address is, but it's at vailresorts.com, I think. You can click that. Then adaptive skiing, looking that up. And Peace Corps definitely has a wonderful site, and they're always looking for volunteers too, and virtual volunteers even right now.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
and so there's yeah, off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of anything.
No worries. No worries. No problem. No problem.
Mm-hmm. But that is a good start.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course,
So
look up Lithuania and see how beautiful it is right now, because it's come a long way from
that's
the
what I've heard.
storytelling.
If
Mm-hmm.
you had to describe it, like, could you compare it to somewhere maybe in the US? Like, is it like maybe by a body of water that reminds you of a certain city here, or is it kind of a standalone place that you can't really compare it to anything?
I wouldn't compare it to the U.S. I would compare the city of Vilnius to a smaller city like Rome, because it's all Baroque architecture. The furthest north city in the world that is Baroque.
Really?
And as well Catholic as well, because I think it's Ireland and Lithuania are about the same latitude. So yeah, because there used to be exchange programs between Lithuania and Italy many years ago. We're talking 300 years ago, and they've got you'll walk out into the courtyards of Lithuania, and you'll see, little old lady with her little babushka on, and kids playing with the ball, and it would look just like something in Italy somewhere, with the sun shining and everything. And then the countryside is just rolling hills, a lot of green, the more colors of green you can imagine, probably like Ireland as well, I think, because it's about the same. And because it's an agricultural city, it's a country, but they're also doing now very many things in IT and more modern development now. So Yeah, it's, I don't know, maybe kind of like Wisconsin, maybe a little bit the countryside.
Yeah,
More,
it could be.
or maybe like Virginia. Maybe like Virginia. Yeah.
I just know that I've heard it's stunning. It's just stunning. So
It is.
I just thank you so much for sharing your stories about what your family experienced, what you experienced, what just people in general, what the country as a whole experienced, and the things that people can now learn from. And also thank you for what you shared about the adaptive ski program with Vail. Just amazing stuff that, to your point, promotes independence and freedom. So with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Indre. And thank you to all of you for watching. And I will look forward to having you join the call again for the next episode. Thanks, everyone.
Forward. Thank you.